Good evening. Welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960 AM News Talk Radio. Well, what a pleasure this evening to chat with Andrea Horwath, the leader of the official opposition in Ontario, the leader of the New Democratic Party in Ontario, a long-term MPP from Hamilton something. I'm not sure what exactly the riding is, but undoubtedly she'll tell us at some point in time. And, someone who's got to be faced with some incredibly interesting positions in this current situation that we're all too well aware of. So, Ms. Horwath, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, it's my pleasure, Mr. Crombie, but how about we use Andrea and Brian? It'll be a lot easier, I think, to have a conversation, and it's my pleasure. I'm honored to be invited and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much. So I had the honor yesterday of speaking with and interviewing the former principal secretary to the cabinet in Ontario. And I asked him what it would be like to be in that leadership position today, dealing with this pandemic, this emergency, COVID-19. Tell me, number one, what is it like for you? And then number two, what do you think it would be like if you were actually in power? And how do you think people are handling it?
Well, I mean, I guess I should start by saying that the people who are on the front lines of this have done an amazing job for us all. I mean, so whether that's the public health folks, whether that's the frontline healthcare workers, in fact, everybody in the healthcare system, they have been doing their very darndest to help us, flatten the curve or plank the curve and prevent the spread of COVID-19. But I have to say that it's been quite, as everybody's been saying, quite a unique moment in time, and one that I don't think anybody has a playbook for. So it's been interesting to watch how, various orders of government, whether it's federal, provincial, municipal, have been dealing with this. But what I can tell you is I'm sure that regardless, folks who are in government are likely working around the clock, trying to figure out what goes on, what to do next. And, as an opposition leader in this scenario, I'm trying to do my best to provide the government of Ontario with ideas, with suggestions, identifying the gaps. Our MPPs, as I'm sure you would suspect, are overwhelmed and inundated in the work that they have to do to try to respond to people who are feeling very, very anxious, very, very worried, very uncertain for the future. And so as we learn of what people's concerns are and their worries are, we try to develop recommendations and suggestions and be constructive with the government. I mean, no doubt, we're an opposition party, so we have a role to play in that regard, but this is a time for us to try to, provide the government with information as much as possible, be constructive as possible, but knowing that there will come a time in the future where we're all going to have to take a look back at this and see what we did well, what didn't go so well, and what we can improve on should something like this come to pass again in Ontario, in Canada, around the world.
Let me ask a couple of just logistical, personal questions, if I could. You're speaking to me from home, so I presume, are you social distancing or physically distancing?
No, I'm not. I'm actually, I'm fine, and I live with my son, and he's fine. So, but I'm just doing what I think is the important thing to do, which is to stay home, which is what we're told to do. So I'm trying to avoid going out too often. I mean, I do have a little apartment in Toronto because I'm there so often. And so I've spent most of the week there. I arrived home late yesterday afternoon, popped out for, a little bit of groceries. And actually, as we're talking, I have spaghetti sauce on the stove. First time I've done that on a Friday afternoon, and I can't remember how long. But I mean, I'm trying to do what everybody else is trying to do, which is social distancing, trying to keep that physical separation and, and be responsible. And I just, I know Canadians and Ontarians are stepping up to the plate in that regard. And I think it's important to thank everyday folks as well for doing everything that they can do to prevent the spread of the virus. And so, in some ways, that's why I'm home this afternoon, is after being in Toronto all week, I'm back in Hamilton, and I thought it was the best thing to do to just stay tight. Our offices are all closed, our MPP's offices, because we're not on the essential list. Go figure, politicians not on the essential list. But in all seriousness, our staff are working from home. Right. So, MPPs are still hearing from staff as to what's coming into the office. We're still responding to the questions and concerns that folks have. and we're monitoring the emails and the phone lines and all of those kinds of things.
And in this situation, I understand that it's a majority government in Ontario today, so it may be very different in Ontario than it would be in Ottawa or in Washington. But are you being at all briefed by the Premier or by people in government?
Well, I mean, what we have done is we've had the opportunity to hear to sit in on the updates from the Chief Medical Officer of Health, which happened, I believe, on Tuesdays and Thursdays. So I've sat on some of those meetings. Recently, the Minister responsible for long-term care, she reached out to us, and so I had a kind of a briefing with her. But that's about it. I mean, they've certainly reached out to us when they need to get something passed through the legislature. So we've had the opportunity to review their emergency motions to get unanimous consent to push legislation through, both this week and last week. Last week we had an opportunity to look at their legislation in advance, but they wouldn't let us kind of take it away and actually pour through it. We basically had a very brief opportunity to look through it, but disappointingly, this past Wednesday, we had the financial statement or the financial update. And unfortunately, although they did offer to take our suggestions, and we were given 48 hours more or less, and Friday evening until the end of day Sunday to provide suggestions and recommendations. Once we put those suggestions in, and we did, I mean, it's our job to be, as I said earlier, constructive and thoughtful about what we think the government should be doing. But we didn't have any engagement whatsoever, unfortunately. Really? There's no back and forth, no sitting down, no engagement, and that was disappointing, because then we went into a lockup. I'm sure you know what those are, budget lockups, and we went into a lockup at 1 o'clock on Wednesday, and then literally 3 hours later we had to vote on the legislation, which we really didn't get much of a time to analyze. So again, I mean, extraordinary times require extraordinary measures. I had just hoped that the government would have reached out on some of the specifics around the bill that they put forward, because we had, I think, some ideas that really would have helped to reduce people's anxieties. And I think it missed the mark in that regard on Wednesday. I don't know if you know this, but I was quite concerned about, not only the lack of I think, appropriate levels of funding for healthcare, which is something that the experts have shared with us, that they're concerned about, but also the lack of any support whatsoever for the financial worries of everyday folks. That was a big missing piece. And again, as I said, Ontarians are stepping up in this crisis. They needed their government to step up on Wednesday, and unfortunately, we didn't see that.
We're chatting with Andrea Horwath, the head of the NDP and the leader of the official opposition in Ontario. We're going to take a short break for messages and come right back with you in a second, so please stay with us. Well, welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960 AM News Talk Radio. I have the pleasure every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock of bringing you fascinating interviews with interesting people. And tonight, I'm very pleased to bring you Andrea Horwath, the leader of the official opposition in Ontario, the leader of the New Democratic Party and a long-term MPP from Hamilton, and someone who I think has seen it at the front lines for numerous different years and has got that experience that we all really want to hear in today's strange environment. Maybe, Andrea, I can ask you a question. Prime Minister Trudeau went from a 10% wage subsidy a week ago to a 75% wage subsidy now. The U.S. in their stimulus bill have dramatically increased the proposed size of it. I had a money manager on my show just a couple of days ago who thought that he thought Ontario would have to increase the amount of stimulus by a factor of 5 or 10. And he said that this is going to be the worst financial calamity as well as health calamity that we've ever faced. Are we doing enough? And what should we be doing?
Well, I mean, I have to say I was pleased that the federal government upped their offer to employers for a couple of reasons. I mean, we've been asking for that for some time. In fact, we asked Mr. Ford to put $2,000 straight up on the table for everybody who's been impacted with job loss or layoffs so that they could get money into their pockets immediately. That's what we were hoping for on Wednesday. But we also wanted to see a top up of that 10%. It's welcome. There's no doubt. And we were looking at around that figure, 75, 80%. As you know, that's what's happening in other European jurisdictions, for example. And that's what, I mean, let's face it, people live from paycheck to paycheck, the vast majority.
That's the truth.
Right? It is the truth. And so I was pleased to see that that the Prime Minister did beef up his offer because people need that financial security. They need to know that they're going to be able to pay the bills and put food on the table for themselves and their kids. But I mean, the other thing is, I was surprised that neither the Ontario government nor the federal government came out with this earlier, because, you know, a couple of weeks ago, I was hearing from the business community, from the large manufacturers and others, that this is exactly what they were recommending to all levels of government. Everybody was being, very responsible and offering even to share in some of that cost. And so here we now are, I guess, for those that are able to take advantage of that, 25% will be the employer if it's going to be topped up by the employer. If not, people will end up with 75% of their wages, which is great. The other important thing here was, though, and still is, for those who haven't laid people off yet, it's the most efficient way to get money into people's pockets. You don't have millions of people rushing to, the EI program or an emergency benefit program or any other kind of program where, where volumes of people just, sink the ability of these new kinds of programs to be able to be accessed electronically or any other way. And so for those reasons, long story short, I'm pleased that we ended up there. I really had hoped that we could have ended up there a little bit earlier, because I'm certain that there are employers that have already laid people off, gone through that process. People have been living with significant anxiety for the last couple of weeks, and at the end of the day, here we are. And as I said, I'm glad that we're here. Having said that, there's a lot of people who are not going to be able to take advantage of that. A lot of companies who are not going to be able to. So particularly in the hospitality industry, right, in the restaurants and the entertainment industry and all of those kinds of places are not going to be able to take advantage of that, because they're just too small to be able to have any liquidity, any cash flow whatsoever. So really hoping that there's
how can we help those small businesses and restaurants?
Well, I mean, again, this is something that we were encouraging the Premier to look at, as well as the federal government. And I guess what we've ended up with is a situation where many of those folks have already closed their doors.
Yeah.
So flowing some kind of liquidity to those folks. And look, we did support the Ford government's initiative on Wednesday. We supported that, although we realized it wasn't enough, and it wasn't necessarily, it wasn't targeting what we thought we needed to see for people, for everyday people. It's great to do tax deferrals and to provide some relief in that regard for businesses. But when you don't have any revenue coming in, how much does that tax deferral really help? And
it kicks the ball down the road, but it's going to end up being a big issue in the future, and everyone's going to know about that.
No, you're absolutely right. And I mean, the other thing that I think is something to think about is if we're able to get through, the beginning of this, because we're unfortunately just at the beginning of it, being able to shore up people and shore up businesses and assure them that they can ride the wave for the next couple of months, then the likelihood of us being able to bounce back, economically, the pain won't be as deep, let's put it that way, in the long run, if we take care of some of those things initially, because people are going to need to have jobs to go back to, which means we're going to need to have companies that are still on their feet, right? Yeah.
Now, we've all probably been watching U.S. network news, cable news, as well as the Canadian. There appears to be a huge amount of partisan bickering in the United States in regards to, did we have enough tests? Have the tests been rolled out? Is the federal government supporting the different states well enough? We don't seem to have that in Canada. Why? Is that because, the Canadian healthcare system and the Canadian federal government has done a far better job, or are we just nicer in Canada?
Well, maybe a bit of both. But I mean, I don't think Canadians would have any of it, to be honest with you. I don't think Canadians would put up with that kind of nonsense. And that, as I said before, there's no doubt that there will come a time when we look at how we did and what we could have been doing better. But right now, what it is time for is constructive, participation. And so, if the government is not taking our advice and our recommendations, we're putting those recommendations out there anyways. But we're trying not to do that in a partisan way, but in a constructive way. Similarly, we didn't like the legislation. We didn't think it went far enough. We didn't think it did what people needed it to do on Wednesday, but we were not going to be irresponsible and prevent, a majority government from putting forward the legislation that they wanted to put forward. It's different, of course, as you know, at the federal jurisdiction where there's a minority parliament, and it forces the Prime Minister to work with the other parties, which is why, there was some pushback on what some would say was a bit of a power grab in terms of the timelines of the initial legislation. But, again, I think people who don't understand how that all works were wondering even then, why was that happening? Why were people having a bit of a disagreement when what we really want to do is focus on helping people and focus on helping businesses and focus on making sure that all of those folks who are still going to work, whether you're in the healthcare system or whether you're in some of those essential services, helping those people get the protective equipment that they need, and so that the rest of us can stay safe while we stay home.
Let me challenge you on this, if I could, just for a second. There was an article in the Ottawa Citizen last Sunday that suggested that we weren't getting the right information. And what it said is that Ottawa had currently confirmed cases of 49 in Ottawa. But the head of public health for Ottawa was saying that he thought the number was actually 4,000. And the reason why was the 49 was a couple of days out of date because you're waiting a while for the tests feedback to be confirmed. I spoke with a gentleman today, by the way, that was tested 10 days ago and still hasn't had the results from the test. And second of all, he said that the vast majority of people are either asymptomatic and or the symptoms are so mild that they're not actually going to get testing. And I've had this myself personally, where I phoned and said I've got some symptoms, and the response coming back is the symptoms aren't bad enough, don't bother going to get tested. And so therefore this head of infectious disease was saying that we're just not testing enough and we don't really know. And based on how fast this transfers and generation by generation of the transfer, his prediction is we actually had 4,000 cases in Ottawa, which means that it's not 10 times wrong, it's 100 times wrong. And if that's right for Ottawa, is it right for Toronto? Is it right for Ontario? Is it right for Canada? And the numbers are astronomically larger, which comes back to, is there enough testing being done? Are there enough tests in the marketplace?
Well, you know what, Brian, I wouldn't extrapolate it through all of Canada, but I would certainly say that that's definitely a worry for Ontario. I mean, as you probably know, we are pretty much at the bottom of the barrel when it comes to our ability to get tests accomplished and then to get the results out in a timely fashion. So, when we talk about things like, and you'll hear this from public health officials, that the virus is going to peak maybe next week, but the question is are we already far beyond that? And it also leads into the whole issue about whether or not we've met the window to flatten the curve. And so this is information that's still, I think, confusing a lot of people. But when folks are waiting 6, 7, 8 days and longer to have the test results confirmed, that's problematic. And when our provincial government here in Ontario is scrambling to try to find the PPE, the personal protective equipment for our frontline workers, and the access to the swabs and the testing kits, that's very, very troubling. Because of course, as you said, I mean, people they don't know, they go about their business. They're, as I said, many people are doing their best in socially distancing, but folks sometimes, don't realize what that means and what the impact is if you're asymptomatic. That's why this virus is taking hold and climbing the way it is.
So it seems to me like we haven't had enough tests, and the testing's not done enough, and it's not structured in a way that we can get the feedback as quickly. And if this was the United States, you'd have someone from the opposition making noise about this. Why aren't you out there making that noise? Is it we just don't know the facts, or that's just not the Canadian way?
Well, no, I mean, it's a couple of things. I mean, I think it's, first of all, I feel like I have a responsibility to not create a sense of fear and panic amongst Ontarians. I mean,
That makes sense.
that's something I take really seriously. I don't think that people take kindly to opposition parties using this particular moment in time to score political points on a government. And that's why I say, when the time comes, we're certainly going to be demanding the answers. But right now, the government should be focusing on fixing the problems and not fending off barbs from the opposition. And then that's why we've been very constructive, right? I mean, that's why we continue to write letters to ministers outlining, sometimes very detailed recommendations about how certain programs are not operating now and need to be shored up. Or, I mean, it's been quite detailed in many ways. But there will come a time when we all have to step back and say, what went right and what went wrong. And there's no doubt that we've been monitoring, as many people have, what's been happening, and we're keeping copious notes. Let's put it that way. And there will, and again, when we get to the end of this, which I hope comes sooner rather than later, but when we do, then there will be plenty of time to have that look back.
Now, you've been critical in the past of our lack of investment in the healthcare sector. What do you think the status of our the capability, the capacity of our healthcare sector to meet this challenge is?
Well, I mean, there's no doubt that that the problems that we have in our hospitals around hallway medicine and a lack of capacity has been around for a long time. And I mean, that's not new. It's been years and years now as governments have squeezed the healthcare budgets. And so, the hospitals were not in a situation to be at all ready for an influx of new patients due to COVID-19. And similarly, our long-term care system is in a shambles. I mean, we have been highly critical of the lack of investment in long-term care. And as you know, there are well over 30,000, close to 40,000 people in line for long-term care. So the waiting list.
Sorry, excuse me, how many?
35,000.
In Ontario.
Wait on a waiting list for long-term care at this point.
How long is that waiting list?
How long is, it's years. I mean, it'll take years and years. The previous government promised to invest heavily in new long-term care spaces. That didn't happen. This current government has promised to do the same. Hasn't really happened. They're kind of re-announcing beds that were announced but never built by the former government. And so both of those systems, which are key systems right now, are at the worst possible level to be able to handle this kind of a pandemic. And so, I mean, even in long-term care, the PSWs, personal support workers and nursing staff that we have are already run off their feet prior to COVID-19 hitting, right? Understaffed, under-resourced. We see all kinds of horror stories of people. And of course, in Ottawa, you've seen a number of, horrifying situations, but it happens around the province where our loved ones aren't getting the quality of care that they need, where they're not getting, where they're having unexplained injuries, and where they're ending up in hospital with sepsis because of lack of being cared for to the proper level. I mean, it's been a horrifying situation. And now with COVID-19, we have these very, very vulnerable people who are, of course, and you've seen, of course, who have now experienced a number of outbreaks in a number of homes, and it's unfortunate. It's horrifying, but it's not unexpected because of the shape of the system.
Yeah, but shouldn't we have, with respect, known this or seen this or anticipated this? We did have SARS 15 years ago, and it was not nearly as infectious and not nearly as lethal from a mortality standpoint. But I remember we had fundraising and other events for healthcare workers, because the healthcare workers were just worked off their feet and really came to the table. And the hotel business and the restaurant business at that time was devastated. And I remember Luminato was one of the things that we came up with as a solution to help the hotel, restaurant, tourism business. So we've lived through, albeit not nearly as bad situations as this before. Don't we look at these things and plan for the future?
Well, I mean, that's exactly the problem. We should have been all along learning the lessons from SARS. I mean, and some of those lessons were pretty clear. I mean, this whole issue of a shortage of personal protective equipment. There was a stockpile that was put in place because of SARS, because of the lessons we learned there. And unfortunately, when governments started tightening their budgets after the last recession, those are some of the things that fell off the table, maintaining that stockload of equipment. And so, so when folks like myself are saying to governments, you can't cut the healthcare budget, you can't freeze hospital budgets, you can't fund healthcare below the rate of inflation. I mean, you're in the Peel region. I mean, fastest growing region in the country, really. And we've seen a real problem in terms of keeping up with the population growth and building new hospitals to meet the needs. So, it's frustrating, I guess I can say, as somebody who's been in opposition for a while, trying to get these governments to do the right thing in terms of funding.
Yeah.
But again, the details of all of this we're going to be looking at more carefully going forward. But it shouldn't be a surprise to anybody that we're flat-footed this way because the investments have not been put in.
We're chatting with Andrea Horwath, the leader of the NDP and the leader of the official opposition in Ontario tonight. We're going to take a break for messages and come back with Andrea in just a minute. Stay with us. Well, welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960 AM News Talk Radio. We have a interesting, fascinating conversation tonight with Andrea Horwath, who is the leader of the official opposition in Ontario, the leader of the New Democratic Party. And Andrea, you've been an MPP for how long?
I was elected in 2004, so that's about 16 years now. It'll be 16 years in May.
And the riding?
Hamilton Centre.
Hamilton Centre, excellent. And when were you elected leader?
2009.
2009. So 5 years as an MPP, and then 10 years as leader. Excellent.
That's right.
During that time period, you've had the opportunity to sit across from Dalton McGuinty, Kathleen Wynne, Doug Ford. You've undoubtedly seen both federally and in the United States different political leaders, and I think that disasters, emergencies are one of the best ways to evaluate, to test leaders and their leadership capabilities. And my personal opinion is that I've frankly been impressed with Premier Ford. I thought, I have been critical of Premier Ford in the past, and I actually questioned whether he believed in science based on some of his criticism of climate change science. But it appears to me that he's actually listening to the experts, listening to the scientists, and he's coming out on a regular basis and seeming to do a good job in presenting the facts and the solutions. I've been unbelievably impressed, if I could just offer it, with Governor Cuomo from New York State, who's coming out on a regular basis in obviously the hot spot in the United States. He's got PowerPoint slides that summarize his talking points. He's touring convention centers that are being turned into hospitals. He just seems to be completely on top of the facts, and he's telling people the harsh realities and truths. And then, President Trump, sort of selling hope that's not got any grounding in reality, and appears to, maybe listen to the chat around the Oval Office for 5 or 10 minutes. I'm being critical, I apologize, but for a short time period before he walks in and ad-libs rather than understanding the details. And then, Prime Minister Trudeau, who I think self-isolating in such a time when it's the right thing for him to do for him and his family, but obviously has got to be incredibly challenging for him when he wants to be in the office managing things, is showing us the right example of leadership. How do you evaluate some of these leaders and how they've done in your mind?
Well, I mean, I think you've given a great synopsis of what we've seen, on the waterfront there. And I mean, I guess the only other thing I would say is that, when in all of these situations, there are also in these democracies opposition parties and leaders as well. And I think we need to look at how they behave as well, which again is something that's been quite interesting. But I think what people want is what people tell me that they want is that they want the goods. Like, they want to know what's going on. Yep. They want to see that their leaders are engaged and are taking their needs seriously and their concerns seriously, and they want communication. And so, I think that you've given a good description of some of the leadership that have been doing well in that regard, and perhaps the president of the U.S. doing not so well in that regard. But I would say this, that here in Ontario, I still hear people telling me that they're confused. They're confused about what their rights are with being laid off, and whether they still have a right to get their job back, or if they take time off sick, is their job guaranteed? So certainly in terms of the press conferences, our premier has done some good work in that regard, showing up and being there and taking the questions from the media. But the broader communication to the public, in terms of what it is that they're actually doing in these legislative changes, I think that's lacking. And I mean, again, I don't want to sound overly critical, but our phones are ringing off the hook. Mr. Ford yesterday got up and said that no tenant has to worry if you can't pay the rent and buy food, don't pay the rent. But there's no protection for those renters. I mean, there really isn't. We were hoping, and we actually asked the premier to put in the legislation that they tabled on Wednesday some kind of a legislative guarantee that tenants wouldn't be evicted when they didn't pay the rent, but that didn't come. And so I think there needs to be some more work there. But you juxtapose that against what's happening federally to some extent, where every day the prime minister gives his update, and then any number of cabinet ministers are also there trying to get into the weeds about what some of the decisions are that they're making and why. I think that's beneficial. I don't see that same amount of practical information and communication flow at the provincial level, and that's what gives people anxiety. It's what makes people nervous, because they don't know what's next, and they don't know how their rights are affected or not affected, and they don't know how to take advantage of some of the announcements that have come. And I mean, even with the federal government's announcement around this emergency benefit, we're hearing folks trying to figure out how and when they're going to be able to take advantage of that, or access some funding. And so I think if there's one thing I can say, it's that the information needs to be drilled down so that everybody has a real clear understanding of of what the options are for them in this crisis, which is creating such a high level of anxiety for folks.
You gave me the open on opposition parties, so I'll take the opportunity if I could. It's a fascinating juxtaposition between what's happening in the United States versus what's happening in Canada. Tonight CNN's going to do a town hall with Joe Biden. 10 days ago, they had a debate between Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders that I'm not sure if you watched it. I'm a political junkie. I watched it with an incredible amount of interest. And it was fascinating how they were using the emergency as a way of underlying their points. Joe Biden about safe, steady, competent leadership, and Bernie Sanders about the need for our socialized healthcare system effectively. In Canada, the Conservative Party has delayed their convention. They're not taking that, they're not doing anything like the Democratic Party in the United States that's almost, using this opportunity to juxtapose their leaders, their potential leaders, to Trump. And in a minority situation in Canada, the Conservatives haven't had leadership debates, haven't been criticizing other than this potential overreach on Tuesday, and have delayed their convention. Do you think it's the right strategy with the Conservatives in Canada?
I absolutely do, in fact, because I think what people would see if the Conservative convention had gone ahead, and certainly this was what I was picking up for those couple of days where it looked like they weren't going to change their dates, right? I was picking up from people this real sense of shock. I mean, really, you're going to go ahead with your convention in the midst of this complete chaos that we're trying to manage in the country and around the world. I mean, I think people that I was talking to were really feeling like it would have almost been the the height of insensitivity to go along business as usual and go ahead with the convention while kind of fiddling while Rome is burning, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Kind of going about your business while the country was literally in a healthcare and economic crisis at a level that we have never ever seen in our history. I think the people I was talking to anyways didn't see that as a very wise path forward. And so I think the fact that they did postpone that convention was the right decision.
And what about Sanders and Biden stepping up and publicly debating and also in town halls and interviews criticizing the president, and yet I haven't seen the leadership aspirants in Canada for the Conservative Party doing anything like that.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's interesting as well. I mean, and again, I think it goes back to that earlier conversation we were having about, how do we handle this kind of crisis in our country versus their country? And I don't think Canadians, and I think that was the fact that folks wanted to see that convention postponed, at least in the circles that I was moving in. I think that's an illustration of exactly that difference, where we hear we would rather see people pull together, focus all of our energy on the crisis at hand, all of our energy and all of our our input and our thoughts and our expertise and our volunteer time and everything we can possibly do. Focus that on the crisis at hand. There will be plenty of time for everything else. Let's pull together and let's try to get this thing dealt with. Let's try to get to the other end of the crisis. And having said that, there's different ways of pulling together. And one of them is to, especially on the health file, where we know tragically Canadians have lost their lives already. Tragically, we're going to see more of that over the next weeks to come. Let's be respectful and thoughtful about that, and we'll have the arguments about what went wrong with our healthcare system and with our response in the future. In the meantime, let's focus on things like getting money in people's pockets, making sure people don't lose their homes, whether that be a renter or whether that be somebody who owns their home or is frankly a small landlord.
Okay, so let me ask some questions in that regard then. Do you think that there should be some prohibition for banks on triggering companies, small businesses into bankruptcy for a certain length of time?
Oh, I absolutely. I mean, I think it's something we need to look at. I think we need to look at that. I think we need to look at, knuckling down on some of those payday loan organizations who, unfortunately, will likely be taking advantage of people who are desperate at this point in time. I mean, these kinds of proactive measures not only give people breathing room, but they financial breathing room, but they reduce the stress and anxiety. And I think you and I both know that we really still are at the beginning of this. I mean, there's weeks and weeks to come where the anxiety.
There was a call today to force banks to reduce interest rates on credit cards, because that's what people are going to be going to finance their short-term problems. Would you support something like that?
I think all of these ideas are ideas that help people, and that's what I think. That's what I think we need to focus on right now. I think, as we said at the outset, this is unprecedented. We don't know where it's going to land. We don't know when it's going to land, both economically and healthcare wise. So let's do everything we can to shore people up in the short term, so that the level of devastation by the time we get to the end of this can be mitigated.
Right. So prohibition on evicting any tenants, you would agree with?
Oh yeah. In fact, we've already asked the government to do that. We asked the government to do that on Wednesday.
Okay.
But they didn't.
And what's going to happen to the real estate market, do you think?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I would ask that question back to you. That's one of the things I really don't know. I mean, you know that here in southwestern Ontario, we've seen quite a significant increase in values, and that's just not Toronto. Of course, it's in everywhere. It's in Mississauga. It's in Peel Region. It's come to Hamilton. It's gone to Niagara, Brantford now. I mean, even London apparently is having. I don't mean even London, but I mean we're going further and further away from Toronto, and the prices continue to rise. What are you hearing? I really have. That's one area that I really haven't spent a lot of time on is the real estate market.
Well, there's the reality of any market is there's two points of view. That's what makes a market. And some people are thinking that the market has done unbelievably well and will continue to do unbelievably well. Other people, including a money market expert I had on my show earlier this week, thinks that the market has been set for a decline for a couple of years now, is way over bid. And we have debt to incomes and debt to rents or values to rents that are at heights that the US reached in 2007 prior to their crash. And we were all just waiting for whatever that pin was that was going to burst the bubble. And this has been the pin. And it could easily be a 20 to 30% decline in home prices, which is what happened in the United States in fall of 2008. And the challenge with that is, he also said, and think about the same thing with small businesses, because, a lot of the fashion boutiques and restaurants and whatnot that line our main streets don't have 2 months of cash hanging around. And if all of a sudden they lose 2 months worth of income, there's going to be a slew of bankruptcies in small businesses. And if we have a massive decline in home values and a massive decline in small businesses, that the whole could be just as bad as 2000 and fall of 2008, 2009. And we all know, we remember how many different stimulus packages, both the provincial and federal governments and the whole G7 and G20 that had to get together to stimulate the economy internationally, get out of that. So we've got two problems now. We had one problem then, which was the financial collapse. Now we've got a health challenge and a potential financial collapse. So we got two problems.
We certainly do. We certainly do. And I mean, that's why when we were talking earlier about what could governments be doing now to try to encourage those small businesses that you talked about, those small retail shops, clothing shops and restaurants. What can we do now to offer them some kind of access to liquidity to help them hold on for those 2 months?
We're chatting with Andrea Horwath, the leader of the official opposition in Ontario and the leader of the NDP. We're going to take one last break and come back, and I'm going to ask Ms. Horwath for her message to Ontarians in this troubled time. Stay with us. Well, my gosh, what a fascinating conversation tonight that we've had with Andrea Horwath, the leader of the official opposition and the leader of the New Democratic Party in Ontario. Ms. Horwath, just before we sign off, do you have any words of wisdom, recommendation, or words of encouragement for the people of Ontario?
Well, I mean, I think it would be just do what you're doing. Undertake that necessary social distancing or physical distancing. Take care of yourselves and each other. We will get through this, and we'll get through it together. And when the time comes, we'll all look back at the great job that we did to keep Ontarians safe.
Andrea Horwath, thank you so much for joining us. I agree with you completely. If I could make one small amendment, and today in my conversation with you, and I have to let everyone know, we took a little break so that Andrea could run away and stir her pasta sauce. And you know what? That's so cute. And what that says is it's physical distancing, not social distancing, because I've known you a little bit for numerous years through politics and other things. But today, given our conversation through computer screens, I feel like I really know you. And so thank you very much. So no social distancing, just physical distancing. Okay.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Thank you very much. And that's it for the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960 AM. Join us every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock. Thanks very much. Good night.